Hello everyone. I hope everyone is well and can you hear now? No. Now? Okay. So great to be here, especially that it's the first personal conference since 1.5 years that I'm able to contribute. So this panel is about Angrynomics, and the expression comes from the book of Professor Mark Blyth, who is joining us through video line. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
We will talk about this issue, which is, concerned about why are so many people angry when we have a relatively sound economy in our Western world, and how politicians are channeling this anger, how does it changing our perspectives for the future. Other panelists are Júlia Király, next to me, professor of IBS Budapest and Corvinus University. She was also deputy governor of the Hungarian Central Bank. Welcome. We have also Martin Sandbu from the Financial Times. He joined us by train through Europe, a very exciting journey. And we have also Martin Wolf, associate editor and chief economic commentator from Financial Times. I hope you are well and you can hear us and see us. So let's start. I would like to start with Professor Mark Blyth. If you could tell us about your book, what is Angrynomics and why does it matter for us?
I would be happy to. Thank you for the invitation to be with you. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Excellent. Right, I will begin. Angrynomics is not a book written for my peers, for other professors. It was a book written for someone at an airport who is trying to figure out why the world is so angry when we keep being told that on average we have never been more well off. So we needed a way to discuss these things and to take a lot of academic research and simplify it without simplifying it too much. So we came up with an analogy as a way of thinking about the problem. It doesn't tell you everything, but we hope it tells you something. So we divide the world into macro Angrynomics and micro Angrynomics. What are macro Angrynomics? It begins from the observation that every time there's a serious financial crash, historically this gives rise to right-wing populism. There's a paper by a German economist called Moderator that pointed this out a few years back. And we began to think about how can we explain this? So we decided to do an analogy. And the analogy is that capitalist economies are a bit like computers. They have various bits of hardware. Think of labor markets, product markets, capital markets. They're all configured slightly differently, but they have common features. And they tend to have the same operating systems. In any given historical moment, there's a set of dominant economic ideas about how we should run these economies. Coming out of World War II and the Great Depression, the purpose of the economy in Western Europe in the Cold War was to produce full employment, because that was seen as the one way to guard against the slide back into fascism and authoritarianism, and also to give an alternative model to communism in the day. That model was very successful, and it was based upon keeping capital at home, reducing the role of finance, pushing high productivity gains through firms to pay for high wages, and to have high transfers in the form of a welfare state. But like all computers that run for a long time with the same code, bugs crop up in the software. And the bug in the software in the 70s was inflation. And inflation was a fatal error for the computer, because inflation at a high rate kills profits. And eventually, capital side of this deal falls apart. This is what we saw in the politics of the 1980s and early 1990s, a rewriting of the system software towards what we call neoliberal ideas, but also significant hardware modifications of the computer, particularly globalization, something Martin Sandbu is going to talk about in his remarks, but also in the form of independence for central banks. because the target was no longer the production of high levels of employment. That was assumed to be a byproduct of simply keeping prices under control and letting markets do what they do. This was a tremendously successful reboot, but it also had some bugs in the software. The bugs in the software were primarily wage stagnation, asset price inflation, and financial fragility, because the way that we cushioned the transition from one system to another was basically through the liberalization of banking. And that produced a huge amount of excessive leverage in the banking system, which came crashing down in 2008. The problem in 2008 was there was no system reset. There was no rewriting of the software. Instead, there was a software patch in the form of trillions of dollars, euros, and yen in central bank liquidity. But the underlying pathologies of wage stagnation for many populations, increasing inequality, and also what I'll talk about next and then hand over to the other panelists, is in a sense of increasing precariousness and fragility in people's lives. That's micro-Angrynomics. Underneath those macro transformations have been 30 years of transformation of product markets and labor markets. Think about Hungary for a moment and its place in the European supply chain networks of the German export manufacturing complex that extends all the way from Germany, all the way right through Hungary, all the way down to Romania. This has been an absolute boon for these economies. The equity investment in the 2000s that made that possible have given very high real wage increases in countries such as Romania in particular. But at the same time, what did they do? They disciplined German workers. They held down the wages there rather than boost it, as well as boosting them somewhere else. So one person's gain became perceived as another person's loss. And that was a way that it could instantly be weaponized by ambitious politicians. At the same time as these product market changes, we have labor market changes, flexibilization, and a part of the rewriting of the code and the software, which we all agreed upon in the 90s was necessary. Structural reform was another of these. But beneath all that were the challenges that they gave to ordinary people living their lives, particularly when family structures were more fractured, and particularly when personal debt loads were higher. So at the same time, we have taken away the institutional mechanisms that cushioned people from the shocks that markets put upon their lives. We have insisted that they take more and more of the strain onto themselves. The combination of these two factors creates fragilities and creates stresses, which can be easily weaponized by ambitious politicians in an environment where the old identities of left and right have fallen away. In sum, that's how we think about Angrynomics. And we hope that if you engage with it, you will find it a useful way of thinking about it too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Indeed, in the second part of this panel, we will talk about how we could strengthen our democracies and the basis for the democracies through the economics. Before we go on, I would like to give the floor to Martin Wolf from Financial Times. What are your thoughts about Angrynomics and about the book, if you have read it?
Well, first of all, it is a great pleasure to be with you. I think you've slightly overdosed on the Financial Times, but that was your decision. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. I'm still being pretty cautious about international travel, being rather older than my distinguished colleague, Martin S., as we refer to him in our dealings with the FT. This is what I want to do. This is a bit selfish. I think Angrynomics is a wonderful book. I wish I'd written it, but I didn't. I think the analysis is very useful and helpful. I'm engaged in, and basically I finished the text and doing editorials on my own book. And I'd like to just give you some flavor of how I see things, which are complementary, I think, and just happen to respond to my ways of thinking about it. Martin will obviously talk about his book, which is also, I think, very, very valuable. So I'm finishing a book which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. I think you can all pretty well understand what that's about. I mean, the starting point has to be, and I'll start with my brutal conclusion, is I genuinely, and I mean genuinely, wonder whether the United States will be a functioning democracy by the end of this decade. And my own view is the odds are against. So this is a pretty serious situation we're talking about. I don't think any other of the major states is in quite such trouble, but I can list some pretty serious troubles elsewhere. So I went back to thinking about democracy and capitalism. And I came to the conclusion that we should think of these two as complementary opposites. In other words, we have an operating system for our society, to use Marx's phrase, which involves a political system and an economic system, which are in some very deep way complementary. I don't think one can have one without the other. I don't have the time to go into that, but they are obviously deeply in tension on two fundamental dimensions. Democracy is local, national. Citizenship is local and national. And capitalism, if you allow it to be, pretty quickly becomes global. You have to work very hard to stop it. And the other is democracy rests on a profound egalitarian premise, and capitalism doesn't. Most of the time we can contain these tensions, but basically the tensions, I think, have torn us apart. I won't go into the history of this relationship and how we got here. Mark discussed some of that in his views on the post-war period, with which I agree. There is a real danger if the economy starts going seriously wrong. On the one hand, there becomes the risk in politics of demagogy. And on the other hand, the countervailing risk is plutocracy. And the two together, historically and now, I think threaten autocracy. That's basically, I think, where we are politically and economically. The balance has gone fundamentally wrong. And here I agree with Mark's description in a different language, which is we have had a greedy, excessively greedy and incompetent plutocracy and technocracy, which have delivered an economy which increasingly has served a large proportion, very large proportion of our population badly, though we could have done more to correct that. And that was proven in the most colossal way with the financial crisis. You can't have a better demonstration of greed and incompetence than that. And it, as Marcus pointed out, the literature shows very clearly that financial crises are extremely bad for the survival of democracies. So I think the biggest danger is some sort of Latin American cycle of instability with a hollowing out of the middle class, and that tends to include autocracies. The solution, in my view, is to rebalance the relationship between democracy and capitalism, which will require complementary changes in politics and policy. The key difficulty, in my view, is not identifying sensible reforms, though we can disagree on that, but to imagine how the politics will deliver them, because right now I see no sign anywhere, even in the US under Biden, of a really effective overall program to transform the situation.
But what should the Biden administration do, in fact, according to you right now?
I think what they have been trying to do is, within their limits, the right things to do. But they have essentially a hung Congress with their own party against them on crucial things. And this means that some absolutely central parts of what they need to do, in particular to deal with the plutocracy, are just not going to happen. It's quite clear they're not going to happen. They are dealing with the macroeconomic situation in the short run in a reasonable way. I think they're actually over-egging the expansionary pudding, but Martin and I disagree on that. That's not a profound difference. But I think the structural reforms that will probably be needed to stabilize and eliminate the enormous anger and insecurity in so much of the society, which is emerging as racism and authoritarianism, I just don't think they will be able to do it, not because they don't want to, not because they don't understand the problem, but the politics won't allow them to do so.
Martin Sandbu, was anger and Angrynomics a reason behind Brexit?
Yes, it was. I like the term Angrynomics very much, and I'll just start with a short anecdote. A couple of years ago, when I was writing what became my book, The Economics of Belonging, I sent a couple of draft chapters to Mark because I respect his judgment, and he very kindly read them and then wrote back and said, "We're writing the same book." That's not true. His is a better read, and I think it sold better too. But the point is, I agree with where Mark is coming from in most of his analysis. What I want to focus on, and this links, I will get to your Brexit question. I want to focus on a particular aspect of this question of how economics determines political anger and therefore the polarization, the polarized and often toxic politics we've experienced in recent years. So Mark and I think Martin, agree that economics to a large extent has driven the politics. There are many people who agree with that, who are good, committed, liberal Democrats who think that it has to do with globalization, and some of the fellow panelists may also think that. I think it's important, and this is something I try to do in my book, to distinguish between economics is the driving cause and economic globalization is what caused the sorry state of our politics. I think that's a mistake, and I think it's a dangerous mistake, because if I'm right that it's an incorrect analysis, it leads you to the wrong economic policy conclusions, namely, try to wind back globalization. Globalization has gone too far, and the wrong political conclusions. So I would just like to spend a minute or two on why I think it's wrong to scapegoat economic globalization. Because then I need to say what has really gone wrong in the economy. And I mean, to sort of give away the conclusion right away, I think it's largely a story of technological change, technological development, and in fact productivity growth. If you look at Western economies, now I'm going to do my little potted history of the post-war 7 and a half decades. They divide into two. You have one half, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, of high growth, high productivity growth, but importantly, economic convergence, falling inequality of incomes, falling inequality of wealth, falling inequality between regions within countries, very important. And then around 1980, pretty much everywhere, that convergence either stagnates or goes into reverse. Globalization sort of took off in earnest about a decade after that. What did happen at the time was that you also saw the peak and fall in factory employment in pretty much every Western country. Give or take 5 years, around 1980 was when it peaked. I think that is largely an effect of how economic technologies develop. At some point, you get so productive, you no longer need more hands in factories, and so you have fewer people in factories. You will often see not just populist politicians, many politicians blame this on globalization. I'll refer you to my book for the deep argument. But I don't think that's right. Economic studies show that you can't really explain most of the fall in factory jobs by globalization. And there's a theoretical reason to suspect that that's wrong. Because if you think about globalization, offshoring jobs to low-wage countries, that's a substitute for increasing productivity at home through automation, new machines, and so on. So being able to send low productivity jobs to low wage countries makes it less necessary to automate at home. If you'd had less globalization, I think you'd probably have had stronger incentives to keep up the pace of automation and squeezing more productivity out of each job than you've actually had. So I think that the economic structural changes we've had in rich countries would have looked pretty much the same even with less globalization. So winding back globalization wouldn't bring the jobs back, and it would probably reduce your economic ability to do things at home that would make things better. What are the sort of things you can do at home to make things better? Well, they are things like making change, the structural changes that will happen, safer for more of the population. That means not allowing a precarious low-wage sector to develop. Mark mentioned this, that precariat is the fashionable word. It's very interesting that both the Anglo-American model of the labor market, very unregulated, and the Southern European French model of the labor market, very highly regulated, both managed to create a precariat in the last 30, 40 years, with a large minority of people being in very insecure and low-paid jobs. So both of them kind of got it wrong, and then Germany managed to move from one flawed system to the other flawed system in the early 2000s. But I think that the big change we need to effectuate, and which we can do domestically, is to shift more of the economy into higher productivity, better paid jobs. And we can have a conversation about how that is done. It's not done by closing borders and reducing globalization. Finally, on Brexit. I think you see that there's a sort of very simple common sense narrative of showing that a lot of the Brexit vote was driven precisely by the people who have been the one losing out from these technological changes and the loss of factory jobs. Factory jobs were good in terms of geographic distribution. The sort of small, medium-sized town is the optimal scale for a factory. You can have a factory economy all over the territory. The changes since then have favored the big cities. And there are studies too that show that differential economic hardship in different parts of Britain led to differential support for first the UKIP party and then for Brexit in the referendum. So I think it's a perfect illustration of this thesis. But the point is that the economic changes that caused real hardship were hijacked in an anti-globalization narrative. It is clear that despite the rhetoric about global Britain, Brexit is deglobalizing. It's about throwing up borders. That's the promise, and that's to some extent the reality. So the conclusion, I think, from the Brexit debate is that those who are committed to liberal and democratic institutions at home and liberal democratic openness across countries have to try to create a narrative that explains why globalization is not in contradiction with a broader, what I call an economy of belonging at home, one that can create broader prosperity for all. So that's the task, I think, for those who believe in the liberal idea.
Júlia, Király, can you give us a couple of examples from this region, Central and Eastern Europe, about how politicians are not really shy using these social tensions when they are willing to get political benefits?
Good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the audience to follow us. So yeah, I think that my role in this panel to prove that Eastern Europe and especially Hungary is different and you cannot understand it, and of course you will prove that you totally, perfectly understand it. So the book written by Mark was suggested to me by my students, and it was really fascinating. The second time, it was, as you said, an airport book for me, because yesterday I reread it on the Brussels airport. Excellent for the second time to reread. And before I answer your question, Sándor, I would like to start with a special event today. As you know, today is 17th of September. I think many of my panelists, co-panelists, all of them, they know why this day is so famous, because 10 years ago, the Occupy the Wall Street started. There was a fantastic survey in the Today Financial Times, by the way, about the Occupy the Wall Street. It's mentioned in the book of Mark. But I think that those who are sitting in this room or listening us and are Hungarian, they know that 15 years ago, it was a special day for us in Hungary. 2006, 17th of September, was the famous publication of the famous so-called Öszöd speech or lie speech of Mr. Gyurcsány. That's how you should pronounce this crazy name. Occupy the Wall Street was an answer on the global financial crisis. The demonstrations, let's say, occupy the Kossuth Square. There is our parliament, okay? So occupy the Kossuth Square in Hungary was before the global financial crisis. It was an answer on the austerity before the crisis, not the first time in Hungary. Every 5 years, we have to stabilize our economy. It happened in 2006, the last time, not the last time, but in the 2000s, that he had to do so. And an answer on these austerity measures, the Occupy the Kossuth Square started, which ended in a political crisis, which ended with the emergence of the Orban regime in 2010, because after the Occupy the Kossuth Square movement, we had to face the global financial crisis. And the anger of the people who were on the Kossuth Square even deepened during the crisis when they faced, which was a social, the deepest social crisis in Hungary, the ethics loan crisis, when most of the people lost their houses. And then they faced all those problems, what you describe so nicely in your book. And these two together, the austerity, the ethics crisis, this led to the shift of the regime and the emergence of the Orban regime. It's always a question, not a good historical question. What happened if Gyurcsány would realize that he has to resign in 2007 or in 2008 after the lost elections? We don't know. But we know that some new regime emerged. And it's not because of plutocracy, not because of too much capitalism or too much democracy. We haven't had yet possibility to experience the real democracy. The capitalism has just started to evolve. So what is the real secret of urbanism? We are still seeking, and Mark, while he describes in an excellent way that in these countries, Poland and Hungary, the nationalist tribalism, that is the energy of tribes, are cynically exploited by politicians. And that's really the essence of the Orban regime. You cannot explain why. Why just Hungary? Why just Poland? We have a very good book published recently by András Körösényi. I think his plebiscite democratic authoritism is a partly good answer on the question that why. And how could our democratic environment be changed so quickly within few years? How could a very atypical plutocracy emerge in the very poor Hungarian society? I think these are the questions which are not tackled in the book of Mark. So when you mention Eastern Europe is only very on the margin. So you understand that, okay, this part of the world hates the migrants. Yeah, we stop all the migrants on our borders, so none of them would like to come here, but we stop them. You perfectly understand how this national tribalism is exploited by the governments. But I think the economic background you somehow misexplain. And here I fully agree with Martin. So these small open economies cannot stop globalization. Globalization, it's our future. We should be able to use it, and to use it for our sake, and not for the sake of our special plutocracy. But what's going on in these countries, and it's not only Hungary, this is characteristic for most of these Eastern European countries, as described by Bálint Magyar and Bálint Medlovics in their book, The Post-Communist Anatomy of the Post-Communist Systems. Some words which are missing from the book of Martin, and I would like if you would react, all of you, on these: corruption, oligarch, and political family. That is our plutocracy, okay? It's not people from the financial world, but people from the political world, the political family who build an economic empire. the lack of transparency. It's not a word about it in your book. And all the long-term problems which are not solved in this part of the world: pension, healthcare, education. I stop now here, and later on we can go further on.
I have an additional question to you, because we know that there are huge inequalities and huge social tensions in Hungary, also in other countries in the region. How is it possible that these tensions are not directed towards the government, but let's say the government is able to channel them by saying, we won't be a colony of Brussels, so he is directing this anger to something else than his government. How do you explain this?
Yesterday I was in Brussels and I stopped it, okay? So if the government people are listening to me, yesterday I stopped Brussels. They will never more come here and try to colonize us. We resist. So I think the special, one special feature of this economies, it's explained by Martin W. and Mark as well. I follow you on the FT. So the past 10 years, do not forget that in this part of the world was not the recession, just the opposite. You could use the EU funds, and using the EU funds and using the very supporting economic environment, it was an economic development. Within this economic development, a significant wage increase, as mentioned by both of you. And this wage increase explains that why the measured inequality did not increase. We have just edited a book, Emerging Eastern European Countries After the Pandemic, and inside it we have a study by Tóth István György, who describes that in spite of our feelings, the measured inequality did not increase in this part of the world. Of course, the unmeasured part, it's terrible, which you can see in the wealth. The economic empire which was built by the political family, and their wealth is not well measured, simply. So you do not see the inequalities, but the people feel it. So that's why the government can always explain that you live better than 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Your wage is increasing, by the way. Inflation is increasing as well, and not only after the pandemic. So in this part of the world, the very, very rapid wage increase increased the inflationary pressure, both not only in Hungary, in Romania, in Czech Republic, even in Slovakia. So in all the that was a similar characteristic of all the Eastern European countries. We cannot avoid, I think, a stable and increasing inflation. And sooner or later, people will become again angry because of economic point of view as well. By the way, if you are interested in why we are angry now, let's go and listen to one of these preliminary elections where these new-made politicians really start that I am angry because of the bad healthcare, because of the education, because the loss of the long-term prospects. So we lost our long-term prospects. And the economic empire built by the political family will be collapsed, as all this kind of empire collapse, as we learned it from Acemoglu and Robinson.
Mark Blyth, do you think that the Western world, the USA and the European Union, learned the lesson of the financial crisis this time during the corona crisis? Because they were really desperate to avoid facing angry masses, angry electors.
Well, I would like to think that what happened was everyone read my other book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, and learned from it. But if you had said to me that a conservative government in the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson after Brexit would basically do what Martin had been arguing for forever, which is unconditional cash transfers to households because of a major macroeconomic shock, and the ability to increase debt by around 20% of GDP all counted, I would have given you very long odds that that would never, ever happen. And yet it has. Now, is it because of a giant revolution in how they think about things? I very much doubt it. I think it's a confluence of certain factors. Number one is structurally low interest rates. When you have $17 trillion out there in government bond from AA sovereigns and AAA sovereigns that are yielding negative, it's very easy to add to your debt pile and worry about it later on. The second thing I think that enabled this was the fact that there has been no inflation meaningfully, except asset inflation, which is what Júlia was talking about, how it feeds from wages into asset prices in Eastern Europe. We see this particularly with housing prices. But in terms of measured inflation, a rise in the level of all prices, that simply hasn't been there. So people like Sunak, the British Chancellor, who's an ex-Goldman alum, clearly understand these dynamics and understand what can be done in an emergency. Whether or not that means there has been a sea change in how they would go forward, that question remains very much open, and I remain somewhat skeptical. So I don't think there has been a huge revolution. I think there has been an editing of the orthodoxy for the current emergency. But that may change. It depends on how long we live in the emergency.
I had something to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure Martin, I think this is a very interesting and important point. I think it's pretty clear it hasn't led to a sea change. If you follow very closely the debates in the UK, at least, I won't go into the US at the moment, we are moving back very rapidly to orthodoxy. And I expect the next budget to show this. Furthermore, and I think more important again, if you look at the UK case, I think the US is again not that different, but not to the quite same degree. There is a well-known feature of the British political system, which you can go back over 200 years, that in a war, the state spends on an absolutely unimaginable scale. One of my favorite statistics is at the end of the Napoleonic War, British government public debt was 250% of GDP. And I think the general consensus, I mean, not the general, almost 100% consensus was that COVID was a war. And we responded to it as a war. Therefore, it doesn't represent a fundamental transformation of the view of how policy should be conducted in normal times. And that is what I think we are reverting to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, could I follow up and offer a different judgment? Because I think there has been a change in thinking in important places. So I do want to talk a bit about the US, where it seems to me that the people running US economic policy at the moment, the team around Joe Biden, very much do think differently from what used to be the conventional orthodoxy. I mean, they're not sort of out there radicals, but they are much more willing to run what they call a high pressure economy, much more relaxed, as Martin alluded to, about large deficit spending to get back to and maybe even above potential. And it's worth noting that the US looks set to not just catch up with pre-pandemic levels, it's already done that, not just catch up with pre-pandemic growth trends, but exceed it, do better than one thought was possible looking forward from 2019. And this is sort of, you know, at least it's thinking people sort of sit up and say, were we wrong about this all along? I think in Europe too, there's been some change in thinking. There it's maybe a little bit less kind of intellectually driven by the people who've been pulled into power, like in the White House, and more just realizing how badly wrong we got it last time with the post-2009-2010 policies. And clearly not wanting to make the same mistake again, even saying it that way. So there are politicians and technocrats who've been around throughout and will not say explicitly, we got it wrong, but they will imply it, and they may even say it in private. And again, you see that the response this time has been much better, where the EU and the Eurozone are set to almost catch up, even with the pre-pandemic trend, something that never happened after the global financial crisis. Just last point on this. because we want to talk about the politics. In the UK, I agree with Martin and Mark that it's probably less likely that you get a shift in thinking, but what you do have is a prime minister who has a supreme talent for winning elections and who clearly sees that these are the sorts of policies that win elections. So I think we'll want to talk a bit about, can a different economic policy program be electorally possible? I think what we're seeing in the UK is, you know, the answer may very possibly be yes.
Sorry, just one remark. So what you are speaking about, and it's really a very important debate and very hot debate, that whether the actual increasing debt in the Eurozone, in UK, in US would support the growth or would induce the inflation. And I think it's really an important debate and will not end in the coming few months. But do not forget, and that's what I can advise to those who are the proponents of the modern monetary theory, which actually is quite fashionable here and there, and they rely on their saying that no matter how much the government spends, it's anyhow can stop the inflation when it comes. So all these three countries, let's take now the Eurozone as a country, they have reserve currency. When we are discussing debates, when we are discussing that how much the government and the country is indebted, you are discussing it from the point of view of a country which has reserve currency, and it's very easy then to do. These countries, emerging Little Eastern European countries, especially those who are not members of the Eurozone, I think it's much more important to understand why to be indebted in foreign exchange is an original sin. Yesterday, Hungary issued the highest volume of government bond on the US market. Okay, it's now really necessary because we are after the pandemic, and I agree with Martin, it's like a war. The Hungarian indebtedness is increasing again, but I am very much afraid that it's a first step again on a bad road.
I would like to stop at this question and ask Martin, because last year when the European Union decided about the so-called recovery funds and the 7 years budget, you know, the markets were really in a bad mood, and this step was needed. But do you think this money will eventually ease tensions of the everyday people in the next 7 years, or it will just go to the big industries as we imagine?
It's this Martin, no? Or was it for my colleague Martin W? It's always a confusion at at work. Look, let me say two things. Until you finish your sentence, I thought you were going to ask, is it going to reduce tensions between Eurozone countries around fiscal issues and transfers and so on? So I may want to say something about that too. Will it benefit people on the ground? I think it's too soon to say, but I note that the reception of the various recovery plans has been surprisingly positive almost everywhere. The net contributor countries are kind of positively surprised by what comes out of Italy and Spain. Financial markets and bank analysts like what they see. It's by design, it's meant to fulfill the priorities of the EU, the green transition, the digital transition, and by all accounts, at least on paper, the plans are to spend money. The plan is to spend money on precisely that. Now, you can spend money on the right things, but badly. So a lot of this will come down to the capacity of the administration on the ground. But I think the money is being spent in the context of a sort of politics, fiscal politics, that I think is much more alert to the need to make people feel the benefit. One part of this is the reasonably broad consensus on having to make the green transition, but also the consciousness that that has to be done in a way that's seen to be fair for the worst off. I mean, this is really on every politician's mind, how to do this. So I would be optimistic. I think it's too soon to say, because we just have to see how this money ends up being spent. But I would say the signs are good. And I will just add in one sentence that I think it's also a good thing that it seems to be engendering some rebuilding of trust between Eurozone countries, the North and the South, between countries and the Commission. If this goes well, and we'll find out quite soon if it goes well, because countries have milestones to fulfill by the end of the year, by the end of next quarter, not Hungary, which hasn't had its plan approved yet, which is why they had to borrow, what is it, 4 billion euros in foreign currency.
$4 billion.
Dollars. But for most countries, we will see very soon if it works. But the signs are much better than I and pretty much most people who observe EU fiscal politics would have expected.
So this could be basically an example how to include people who are, left behind by the globalization, how to include them in the future when we change our economies, isn't it?
Look, I think it could, but it may do so in a more roundabout way. It's because if these things are seen to work at the micro level, the discussions at the macro level will be easier. There's going to be a big debate on the fiscal rules, how fast, this was mentioned before, how fast do we return, hopefully not to sort of 2010 style austerity, but to what passes for fiscal responsibility. In fact, fiscal responsibility now is to spend quite a lot. But the macro level, if the micro level works well, both economically and politically, at the macro level you may get policies that benefit the people on the margins more. Because in the end, it's very often the macro stance that determines whether whatever growth you have trickles through, feeds through to the people on the margin of the labor market, people in the lower paid jobs. They're always the last to benefit in a boom and the first to be hurt in a bust. So these macro cycles actually have very differential distributive effects. So I think it would be in that kind of roundabout micro to macro way, if that happens.
Martin Wolf, if you could give just a couple of advices to decision makers, how to broaden, the economic basis, how to include people so that democracy survives, what would be that?
Is that to me?
Yes, it's to you.
Sorry, I didn't hear the earlier discussion. Can I just I broadly agree with Martin on the EU program. This is important. I think it went broadly in the right direction. It's an ambitious program from the EU's point of view. But in relation to your question, and perhaps it leads to the next, it is very important to note that against the Eurozone economy as a whole over quite a number of years, it's not that large. And some of the economies they're trying to help are deeply depressed, like Italy's, in my view. So I think they're going to have to do more. And this gets into what is a really big issue, which is how much fiscal solidarity the Eurozone will be willing to show in the long run. And that is related, of course, as Martin said, to the fiscal rules that they have introduced. And I read that in the German debate, there is active discussion, obviously we don't know who's going to be elected, of reimposing the Stability and Growth Pact, or is it now called I think it's now the Growth and Stability Pact. It's gone through both. So I think there are very big questions about the future. That's one. Two, on the broader point, I'm pretty passionately opposed to MMT, which was mentioned. But I think broadly speaking, macroeconomic policy has to be expansionary. I'm probably not as enthusiastic about it as Martin, but I think it's one of the things we learnt after 2008. I think by and large, policymakers have understood this to a degree, and we have to continue with that. We have to take the risks of fiscal and monetary expansion. I'm not completely convinced that the Americans have got this right, but broadly speaking, I'm in favor of that. I think we agree on the the need to start re-regulating labor markets in an intelligent way. I think that's really quite important. And an important part of that, and I don't know how to do this, but it seems to be incredibly important, is to reinvigorate labor's role in the economy. Labor workers' representatives in company boards is something I've become increasingly interested in. We can't have such an extraordinary imbalance of power as we've now created. So I think that's really important. And the final thing, there are lots of things that Martin believes in, I don't, but there's one thing which I have probably to surprise come round to, is that we are going to have to tackle extreme wealth directly. Now, I've tended to think this should go through swinging inheritance and gifts taxes. He favors a net wealth tax. We can discuss that in detail, but I don't think we can live with the scale of inequality that we've seen. And the very last thing, which is overlap between politics and economics, is, and where it worries me most, is the role of money in politics. We can't run a democracy and that was part of the Brexit campaign, for God's sake. We cannot run a democracy in which a relatively small number of rich people own the political system. They bought the Supreme Court. So there are a few suggestions which I think are really important, some of which are radical, which we should be thinking about.
Júlia, you want to add something?
Yeah, because I think it was very important that Martin said about the development and the way of using government money and these programs. So let's take a personal example. During the summer, I live in a fantastic island, which is in the middle of the Danube. If you can imagine an island in the middle of a river, but it's a fantastic island. There are no big changes, Mark, by the way. So big changes in the world. In this island, it looks like 40 years ago. Bumpy roads, no plaster, nothing. But 2 years ago, in the middle of this big nothing, a fantastic new building was built. It was called Hungarian Slovakian Remote Training Center. It had nothing to do with Slovakia, nothing to do with remote, with training, but huge. The whole conference can be held there. Since then, it's empty. It stands in the middle of the big nothing. It was built from EU funds, of course. Okay? So that's the most important, that the structure of the government money and your taxpayers' money, it's not the same what and how it spends for. So what we need is democracy, checks and balances, control, stop the corruption, and then the inequality of wealth will not increase, especially in this part of the world. Because what's happened in the past 10 years, then European funds, the taxpayers' money of your countries, went straight to these big funds, not state funds. Sometimes they are called state wealth funds, but they are very, very private. And that's how these kind of buildings and this kind of investments happened here.
We have approximately 10 minutes left from the discussion, so I would like to turn to the audience. If you have any questions, yes, I see already one hand.
Okay, I'm Dirk Hollemans from the Green European Foundation. First of all, thank you very much. I think it is one of the most relevant debates during this Congress. But returning to the introduction, we were talking about the computer and software and system faults in the software. I'm really almost shocked that we are not having included in the debate the climate collapse, the collapse of biodiversity. I heard it's good news. Economic growth is going better than we thought had. Until today, economic growth goes ahead with an increase in energy consumption, goes with increase in resource and material consumption. So I would really say I really like a lot of proposals, but please, if we have a Congress on sustainable democracy, let's also include in our analysis of the system faults in our software, the way our biosphere, this teeny layer where we're living with all the other living creatures, we are destroying it. So please, if you discuss, well, it's good news, we have again economic growth as before, is it sure that it's good news? That's my question.
Very important questions indeed, and especially the transition of our economies will produce some social tensions as well. I see Martin already has the microphone. You want to react?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, and I don't talk almost not at all about climate in my book. And when people ask why, my answer is in part, even if we didn't have a climate crisis, we would still have all these problems to do with economic development leading to toxic politics. You know, that doesn't, I'm not saying in any way that the climate change isn't existential, but we already had this problem. Now we have two problems, and they relate to each other in interesting ways, but we need to be able to, while we keep, you know, we keep in our thoughts that there's also a climate crisis, we do need to devote enough attention to the politico-economic democratic crisis as well. So I just want to sort of say there is room for having this discussion without that meaning we are dismissing the climate challenge. Now, as you just hinted at, the climate challenge in some sense makes things harder. And I want to mention one way in which it makes it harder, which is it's another deep phenomenon that is going to change our economic structure. It will have to. And that means that we're going to face the same challenges as we did with the shift away from the factory economy in the 1980s, which I contend is at the root of the politics that have becoming worse over the last 40 years. So we're facing a new structural change, same thing with digitization, by the way. And I think the political problems we can already see are quite similar. So, you know, rather than saying that these you know, climate, we need to think about climate and not about these other things, I'm not suggesting you said that, I think we can learn from the discussion we've already had about what we need to keep in mind as we tackle the climate crisis. And I think we're doing that reasonably well, actually. I think politicians are aware that you needed to have a just transition, as the saying goes. And we know that because if we don't have a structural change that works for pretty much everyone, then we should expect the same results as with the last structural transformation that didn't benefit everyone, which is, you know, Trump, Orban, populism, whatever, the anti-democratic forces that we're talking about. So I'd like to, I don't want us to be sort of discouraged and saying we have to pick one existential crisis or the other. These things are related in complex ways that we really need to understand well. But on the whole, I think the fact that we are faced to do a new structural transformation gives us a chance to get it right this time. It's not easy. I feel I didn't answer your previous question entirely well, but one thing I could say about these plans, for example, green infrastructure isn't in itself necessarily going to benefit everyone. Who knows? But that is the challenge, right? We need to think about having faster trains or electric vehicle charging points or broadband connections. We need to have those to shift our economy in a green and digital direction. Then we need to do whatever it takes to make sure that everyone in those economies can actually sort of belong to, I use the word belonging, plug into that new economy. So we need to build a new economy and we need to bring everyone into it. Tall order, but we can't aim for anything less.
Martin Wolf, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I think this is really incredibly important. But basically, I didn't discuss it because that would have taken us the whole hour, and we'd only started. But I've written about this in my book. It was a pretty obvious question. What will we need to do to economic output worldwide to solve the climate change, essentially through global austerity, through not producing the way we are? Well, the broad answer, we can discuss the detail, is we'd have to undo the last 200 years. I mean, that's pretty obvious because what we've created was a fossil fuel-based economy. So if we'll just focus, everything else is the same. We just decide, well, we've got to degrowth, as one book talks about. It's pretty obvious this is not going to work. So essentially, well, not going to work politically, socially, or any other way, and it will be a moral catastrophe. So we basically got to go through the most rapid and profound technological transformation humanity has ever done. And that is the only way to do this. And to do that, we have to be probably about 10 times as radical as we're now thinking of being. That is, I think, pretty clear. And I think it's a very good question whether we will be so. But I would strongly advise those who feel passionately about this to focus on this latter approach, because I think it's the only way we're going to get there. In other words, massively increase the radicalism with which we approach the climate change challenge, but don't try to get there by telling everybody in the world, actually, the entire living standard we created in the last 150 years, it's gone. It's not possible.
Our time is unfortunately over, so I would give the floor for 1 minute to Professor Mark Blyth, because he's raising his hand since 5 minutes, and I think something important.
Okay, then I shall maximize my minute. I just want to talk about the tactics of politics, reflecting on what everyone has said. Why is it that populists win? Because they deny the climate crisis. Because you don't have to think about the hard stuff. Because it's really easy. You just have to somehow recover a golden past, which includes people who look like us, act like us, and think like us, and exclude everyone else. The problem with progressive politics is, to use Martin Sandbu's language, it's about the just transition. It's about the marginal worker. It's about those who are on the margins, who are the ones that benefit least and get hurt the most. For populist politicians, this is a non-problem. They don't care about the just transition or the transition. And they care about the median worker. They care about the person right in the middle, that if they can capture them, they can stay in power for a very long time. And I think that there is a lesson there for progressive politics, that ultimately, if we concentrate so much on the margins and notions of justice, we will fail to capture the people that we need to get where we need to in terms of a just transition. And that is the dilemma electorally, I think, that many parties face in Europe. And I will stop there, because that was a minute.
Thank you very much for the conclusions. Thank you for the audience and for our panelists also. It was really interesting to listen to your arguments. Thank you.